Hi everybody, I'm Matthew Leonard, Executive Director at the St. Paul Center for Biblical Theology, and today I have a real treat for all of you as I am joined by my good friend and colleague at the St. Paul Center, Mike Aquilina. Now, as many of you know, Mike is an expert on the Fathers of the Church. In fact, he's the impetus behind our newest Journey Through Scripture study, The Bible and the Church Fathers. And with regard to the sordid rumor that I threatened to lock him in a room and make him watch continuous reruns of Knight Rider if he didn't help us with it, I can only respond, no comment. Now, you've probably seen Mike on TV with Dr. Scott Hahn, co-hosting one of the numerous series they've done together for EWTN. Perhaps you've seen him or heard him on the radio, or seen him in a documentary, or enjoyed him live at one of the many talks that he gives around the country. In his core, though, Mike is a writer, which is why most of us have encountered him through the numerous articles and books that he's written on topics like the Fathers, angels, Catholic doctrine and history, family life, and much, much more. His latest book is Faith of Our Fathers, Why the Early Christians Still Matter and Always Will. And you can find it and scads of other Mike Aquilina books in the bookstore at salvationhistory.com. Now, why has Mike joined me today? Because we're celebrating the feast of St. Ambrose of Milan. And Mike is going to share some tidbits with us about this great father and doctor of the church. So welcome, Mike Aquilina.
Great to be here, Matt.
I would like to know, or I'd like you to share, first of all, with our viewers, this great story about how it is that Ambrose basically went from being an unbaptized believer to bishop in one fell swoop.
Well, let's back up a little bit.
Fine. You're the boss.
He came from a Christian family, Ambrose, and he was raised in a devout environment. His sister became a consecrated virgin. He remembered her taking her vows at the Basilica of St. Peter's in Rome when he was a very young boy. So this is the kind of memory he had from his childhood. He grew up in a devout home, but he deferred baptism till he was an adult.
Was that a common thing at the time?
It was common to defer baptism at that time. We find this in the lives of many of the fathers. Basil the Great, for example, Jerome, and Augustine, of course, is the most famous example. It was very common. Augustine is the father who turned the tide against that practice and really encouraged the practice of infant baptism. That's starting to turn at the end of the 4th century, the beginning of the 5th century.
So how did it work with Ambrose and his becoming bishop?
So Ambrose grew up in a family that was devoutly Christian, also a family that was part of the imperial machinery, the administration, really the top echelons of power in the empire. His father had served as a governor, a regional governor, and Ambrose himself kind of moved into that position. Now you have to understand, the 4th century was a time of great tumult. It started out with the most severe persecution against the church that had ever been up to that point, the persecution of Diocletian. And that continued until the time of Constantine. Now, with the reign of Constantine, we have a period of peace for the church, of stability. Constantine gives Christians, and really all religions, the freedom to practice, to worship as they so choose. Constantine was a wise ruler, a very rare sort of ruler we get once in a millennium or so. But he didn't live forever, and his sons did not rule as wisely. Constantine was able to keep peace in the church among many factions. His sons, not so much. And then after his sons came Julian, the ex-Christian, the apostate,
right,
who really had attitude about Christianity. So Julian really makes it kind of warm for Christians, and he makes sure they know they're on the outs, and he makes sure they know that the tide is turning against them. He tries to re-institutionalize paganism in the empire after a generation of Christianity. Now, Julian has a mercifully short reign, and after that, Christianity is once again reestablished as really the majority religion of the empire and something that's safe to practice. But the generation that grew up in that period grew up in an age of real insecurity. Ambrose knew that insecurity. And growing up in a Christian home as he did, he must have known it as a real threat to life and limb. His father, as an imperial governor and as a Christian, must have known the sense that he could die as a martyr at some point in his life. So Ambrose grew up with that, and he grew up knowing that that Christian unity was a precarious thing, Christian orthodoxy was a difficult thing, and it could require real sacrifices. So Ambrose comes to his maturity, and he too is made a governor like his father, and he is made governor in the most important administrative and military city in the empire, Milan. Now we think of the Roman Empire, we think of its capital city as Rome. Not at this point. Rome was too vulnerable to barbarian incursion. So the Romans had actually moved their administrative center north to Milan. So Milan is an important city in the empire. The poet Ausonius listed it among the most important cities in the world. He listed it as number 7.
Wow.
So this is an important city in the world. It really is the nerve center of the world at this point, along with Constantinople. The Western emperors are seated in Milan, and really that's what drew a lot of people there. It's what drew Augustine to Milan, and what drew Augustine into the life of St. Ambrose. So he's made governor in this city, and because it's such an important city, it really is kind of the place where the tectonic plates are moving, all right? It's a time of great religious ferment, and all of those religions are present in Milan. You still have the old paganism. You have the senator Symmachus, who's agitating for the restoration of the altar of victory as an official site of the Roman Empire. You have Manichaeans coming from the east and kind of introducing this esoteric New Age religion into Milan. And then you have the Christians, who are really sharply divided. You have Arian Christians, who don't hold to the doctrine of the Trinity as we know it today and as it was known in the early empire. The Arians believed that Christ, the Word, was not co-eternal and co-equal with the Father. This is problematic for orthodoxy. But they were ascendant at that time, and they really held sway over many of the emperors and some of the bishops. In fact, the Bishop of Milan, when Ambrose was made governor, was an Arian. So that bishop dies in the natural course of events, and there's a lot of agitation in the city over who would be his successor. And Ambrose, as governor, is afraid that there are going to be riots. So he goes into the city to try to quell the crowds, and people had already started to gather into the city. So he's trying to talk the people down from their anger, from their anxiety, from their agitation. And while he's talking them down, suddenly a little child in the crowd says, "Ambrose for bishop."
From the mouths of babes, right?
Ambrose for bishop. And the crowd takes up the chant. Ambrose for bishop. Ambrose for bishop. Ambrose for bishop. And you can imagine the thoughts that are racing through his mind at this point. This is not the course that he had plotted for his life. Ambrose thought that he would serve as governor for a while and then have a leisurely retirement in philosophy. To that point, he had lived as a celibate. He had lived giving his life to civil service, but also he had dabbled in philosophy. And he also was studying Christianity. He was a catechumen in the church, even though he had not yet been baptized. So the crowd takes up this chant, and the word reaches the ears of the emperor, and the emperor lets Ambrose know that this is what he wants for Milan. And just imagine the choice that's suddenly foisted upon Ambrose. Not only is he to receive baptism, which would have been a momentous choice for a Christian, an adult Christian at that point, but he's to take on the most important bishopric in that region, and one of the most important in the world, one of the most influential, because it's the see where the emperor is living. And not only that, but it's a divided see, and even within the imperial court you have Arians and Orthodox Christians. What's going to happen? Well, he gave in. It seems that he did win certain reassurances from the emperor. The emperor gave him his guarantee that there would be religious peace in Milan as long as he was emperor. and he stood by that. So Ambrose went into it with certain assurances, and he went into it with gusto. He went into it with the confidence of a child of God.
It's interesting because here you have a governor who's becoming bishop, and the emperor signing off on this. So there was a relationship here between church and state, and we have the issues that kind of fly around today of church and state and who has what authority and how is it wielded, and that was really an issue back then as well.
It was a big issue back then. The church and state, throne and altar. Who's in charge here? And the questions were largely unanswered. Constantine really blurred a lot of lines, but he kept peace. His sons, not so much. And they really used the appointment of bishops as political measures. And this continued in the time of Julian the Apostate. And Julian allowed all of the exiled bishops from various factions to return to their sees, so there would be a lot of contention. Then, after Julian died, the emperors had to deal with this mess where there were all these contending bishops. And it was hard to see who was in charge, because the emperors had a stake in this, because the peace of the church was the peace of the empire at this point, because Christians were in the majority in almost every city in the empire. So yes, you would occasionally have these flare-ups. Who's in charge in matters of state that were really moral matters? You also had these flare-ups of who's in charge in religious matters, because the emperors had a keen interest in religious matters because they affected the peace of the empire.
Now you mentioned that as an aristocrat, or he had this kind of aristocratic background, he becomes bishop, and he had planned on having a life where he studied philosophy after he retired. So did he continue to engage the intellectual currents of his day after he became bishop, so he wasn't just a theology guy, but really engaged culture?
It seems that Ambrose was one of these men whose minds are always active. It seems that he engaged a lot of the fathers who went before him. He knew the works of Origen very well. He knew the works of the Jew, Philo. He knew the works of the Jewish theologian, Philo, very well. And these show up in his preaching a lot. He also knew the works of Cicero. Cicero was profoundly influential on Ambrose, and Cicero was a pagan. He knew the works of Plotinus, the Neoplatonist philosopher, and it seems that Ambrose was engaging the work of Neoplatonic philosophy as it was developing in his own day. There was a great school of Neoplatonic philosophy right there in Milan, and it included both Christians and pagans. Kind of having this lively conversation, this very fruitful conversation as the decades wore on. And there were a lot of conversions to Christianity that came through that school of Neoplatonic philosophy. It seems that Ambrose was in touch with that school and very much encouraging its work. So he was an engaged intellectual. He also knew what was happening in terms of legal philosophy and the philosophy of government as it was developing. And it was developing quickly in this time because this was a time when there were barbarian incursions from outside, and the empire was trying to find its modus vivendi. The empire was trying to figure out how to live with this unwieldy, far-flung group of lands, this coalition, this uneasy coalition that was always being attacked from outside.
Now, he wasn't just engaging intellectual thought, paganism, and other Christians, because a lot of our viewers know that the fathers of the church, there are about 100 of them. And this is 700 years of church history we're talking about, from about the time of Christ. But a lot of them lived at the same time, and they had relationships with each other. So Ambrose was also engaging other fathers of the church, or eventual fathers of the church. Who did he know, and how did he interact with them?
Well, of course, the most famous contact he had was with Augustine. And unfortunately, Augustine is such a giant in church history. That's not unfortunate for the church.
Right.
But it's unfortunate, I think, for Ambrose's legacy, because often Ambrose is treated as kind of a stage prop in the life of Augustine. And that's unfair, because he was a giant in his own right. He's one of the four great fathers of the Western Church. He's one of the 4 original doctors of the Church.
If there was no Ambrose, there might not be an Augustine.
That's right. Ambrose was the catalyst for Augustine's conversion. His preaching made Ambrose's preaching created the conditions of possibility for Augustine's conversion, because Augustine was at an impasse. He just had reached a roadblock intellectually and spiritually, and Ambrose showed him the way through. So, Augustine is the most important contact of his life, but certainly not the only one. Ambrose engaged the fathers who went before him by reading them. We can see that, but he was also in correspondence with so many of the great figures of his time. He was in correspondence with Basil the Great out in Cappadocia. He was in correspondence with Paulinus of Nola, who would carry so much of Ambrose's legacy into the next generation. And of course, Augustine did so much to preserve the memory of Ambrose and show us Ambrose as he lived in the day-to-day, as he administered his see, as he received visitors, as he practiced friendship, as he was in the pulpit. Through Augustine, we get so much of Ambrose's character.
Now, Ambrose was also really concerned with the character of Christians in general, and if Ambrose was to show up to the 21st century Catholic Church and take a look around, what do you think he would think? And particularly, in relationship to the laity, how it is that we live, because he was pretty concerned with this.
He was concerned with the laity and as they lived in the world. In very significant ways, he was concerned about those lay members of the church who were exercising administrative roles in the government, especially the emperors. And he could take a hard line with them. He could take a hard line. He dealt with all the emperors in different ways, because every situation was different, and every emperor was a different sort of Christian, different spirit, a different soul.
Tell us the story about Theodosius.
Well, Theodosius, Ambrose had a warm relationship with Theodosius. He could speak frankly with him. And Theodosius respected Ambrose because, as he put it, Ambrose was a bishop who knew how to bishop. He had a lot of respect for him because Ambrose had been an administrator. Ambrose could talk Theodosius's language. Well, Theodosius was a devout Christian, and he was an Orthodox Christian in a time when not all of the administrators of the empire were Orthodox Christians. But Theodosius was not a perfect man, and he was a somewhat impetuous man, temperamental, and he made some big mistakes with his temper. At one point, there were riots in Thessalonica, in Greece, and the riots led to the deaths of certain administrative officials. Theodosius was so angry about this, and he was so loyal to those officials, that he had all of the citizens of the city summoned to the amphitheater. They didn't know why they were being summoned there, but they were being summoned to their death. He had them all mowed down while they were trapped there in the amphitheater. Thousands of them. This was a heinous act. It was a horrific act. It's hard to fathom how someone could do that. He was thinking like a warrior. He was thinking like a pagan. He was thinking like the emperors of old. Ambrose recognized this, and he barred the way of Theodosius into the church when Theodosius dared to show up at the church. He barred the way to communion for Theodosius. He forbade him to approach the altar for Holy Communion. Theodosius was excommunicated until he performed public penance so that the church could see that he was a repentant sinner and had won absolution, and so had won the right to approach the altar once again.
And to his credit, the emperor complied.
The emperor complied. He humiliated himself. He won a certain degree of humility. And it was an edifying example for the church. We find Ambrose dealing with different emperors in different ways. The Emperor Valentinian and his mother, Justina.
Right.
He had to deal with it in a different way. And there, the emperor insisted on providing a place for Arians to worship in the city, and he tried to take over a certain basilica. Ambrose did not approve of this. He would not allow it. And so he called upon his congregation to occupy the basilica. So the crowd, the Christians of Milan, went into the basilica to pray. Peaceful protest. And they knew that they could die as martyrs as a result, because the emperor had ordered the basilica to be turned over to the court, the Arian court. The emperor ordered the military to take the basilica, and the military started to close in. The people kept singing hymns. Ambrose was a great writer of hymns. The people sang these hymns and they prayed as the military closed in. And we're not sure what happened. We're not sure whether the army, which was largely Christian, could not bring itself to do it, to take over the basilica, or whether Ambrose just stared them down and won. Either way is possible. Either outcome is a possible reading of the situation. What we know is that Ambrose won this staring contest. The emperor backed down, and Ambrose kept the basilica, kept it pure from Arian taint. I like to say it happened through hymns, with hymns, and in hymns.
That's great. All right, I want you to close with the story of Augustine's encounter with Ambrose and Ambrose's reading. And a lot of people, call Ambrose the father of silent reading. So tell us the story there.
Well, Augustine arrived in Milan at the pinnacle of his career. He was offered the chair in rhetoric at the imperial court. It doesn't get any better than this. And yet he felt empty. He felt like he had reached the top of his career and he just didn't have fulfillment in life. And he knew that spiritually something was lacking. He tried a lot of different things. He dabbled in these New Age spiritualities. He couldn't bring himself to embrace the Catholic faith, though, because he found the Old Testament so scandalous. Well, his mother arrived in Milan, and his mother took on Ambrose as her spiritual director. Ambrose gave her wonderful spiritual guidance and really encouraged her to be patient with her son and to pray for her son. She did. It's a great Saint Monica. She prayed through 17 years for her son's conversion and won it from God.
Wow, mothers take heart.
Yes. So Augustine listens to Ambrose's preaching, which is taking place in the context of the liturgy. And he's listening to him preach in this graced moment. And he's hearing Ambrose preach the Old Testament as it's fulfilled in the New Testament. And he sees that so much of the Old Testament that he found wanting was indeed wanting of fulfillment. Fulfillment in Jesus Christ. And he came to see Jesus Christ as that fulfillment. And then Jesus Christ became for him this lens through which he could understand the Old Testament and its rough parts, because it wasn't as polished as the Cicero and the Virgil he loved so well. Mm-hmm. So it was the interpretive key that he needed. Well, he did go to Ambrose personally, but I think he found Ambrose kind of intimidating, and he found himself so wanting in the spiritual gifts that Ambrose so evidently possessed. So he went to Ambrose, but not as often as his mother would have liked. And he does talk about sometimes going and kind of watching Ambrose from a distance, standing off in the waiting room and watching Ambrose reading. And it struck him because Ambrose was reading silently. And that was uncommon in that time. Most people read aloud from their books, and books were written to be read aloud.
Is that because it was in a literate society and a lot of people couldn't read silently, or what was the rationale for that?
I think it was just a habit of reading. It was a habit of reading, and so a lot of what was written had this poetic thrust, because it was written as not only a mental pleasure but also an oral pleasure. It rolled off the tongue and it sounded beautiful to the ear, so it had a musical quality. Well, he was watching Ambrose so absorbed in the text, and it was a spiritual experience for him, and it moved Augustine to watch him so absorbed. And Augustine watched from afar and could not bring himself to interrupt such a beautiful sight, such a beautiful thing, a man absorbed in prayerful reading of the Holy Scriptures and of the Church Fathers. It really did kind of awaken in Augustine a desire to be that kind of man. And when we look back at these lives, Ambrose's life and Augustine's life, it should awaken in us a desire to imitate them and to be so absorbed in these works and to allow these works to transform us and to lift us up to Christ.
You're a great man, Mike.
Matthew.
Thank you very, very much. It was inspiring.
You're awesome, dude. It's great to have this conversation.
Absolutely. If you would like to be absorbed in some silent reading, don't forget you can go to salvationhistory.com, where we have all kinds of free resources for you to grow in your spirituality and come to love our Lord more deeply like Ambrose. God bless you.